Welcome back to Raised by Giants live discussion. Welcome everyone in the chat. Good to see you guys and any moderators out there or channel members. We have an amazing show lined up for you guys here today with an episode brought to you by Contact in the Desert this year, 2024 in Indian Wells, California. Really great lineup of speakers this year, May 30th through June 3rd. Get your tickets now, and I will be there. So come by and say hi. Link to the on-sale tickets is in the description of this video. And if you use promo code EARTH10, you'll get 10% off your original ticket price. And today we have with us the keynote speaker this year at Contact in the Desert, retired U.S. Army intelligence officer, Desert Storm veteran, and 7-year alumnus of the Department of Defense's Stargate Remote Viewing Psychic Spy program, returning guest to the show, Dr. Paul Smith. Welcome back. It's good to see you, my friend.
Nice to be here, too. It's always fun to be on board with you.
So, yeah, thanks for coming on. It's been a minute, almost a year now, and we did meet in person at Contact in the Desert last year, which was really cool, and I sat in on your lecture, which was a very interesting lecture. What will you be lecturing about this year at Contact?
Well, the plan is to talk about remote viewing and UAP, UFO associations. So, half the time I never know whether to say UAP or UFO. It depends on the audience. I guess your folks are probably well acquainted with the UAP acronym. Am I right in assuming that?
Yes, and I think that it's interesting with the UFO to UAP title, because I'm pretty sure that the original name switch came from Project Blue Book, because it was called Flying Saucers, and then it was changed to UFO by the Air Force in Project Blue Book to encompass more of the phenomenon, and then they changed it again to UAP to encompass more of the phenomenon.
Yeah. So have you guys talked about why they made that change?
From UFO to UAP?
Yeah.
I mean, from my personal opinion, I think that it was to encompass more of the phenomenon. You get more things under the banner of UAP than with UFO. It can encompass plasma. It can encompass a lot more things than just UFO.
Yeah. It is the problem is the original term has brings with it some embedded assumptions, right? When you say unidentified flying object, which of course what UFO stands for, then you make two assumptions. First of all, that it's flying, and the second of all, that it's an object. But we don't know that it always consists of either of those things. So because it's in the air, we assume flying, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's flying. It may be propagating through the air in a mode that might not really be flying in a sense, so we might mean that. And of course, object, I'm convinced that a lot or maybe all of these things are objects, but they may not be. In the first case, maybe they just appear to be objects. In the second case, maybe some of them are objects, but other ones aren't. And as you've mentioned, plasma, some kind of plasma artifact, I guess, I don't know, or flat plasma phenomenon might account for some of these observations. So changing it to UAP eliminates all that assumed theoretical basis as to what the things are and allows us to talk about it in a freer way, I guess you could say.
Yeah, because phenomenon can be a myriad of things. Object means a physical object. So unidentified flying object, you assume it's a physical phenomenon. And then with UAP, it's different. It encompasses the entire phenomenon, because the phenomenon title is in the name of UAP. Have you looked into, because I really think that where the phenomenon in general is kind of heading is more of a USO based narrative. Like they're going to start, talking about more of USOs and these objects coming out, this phenomenon, again, coming up out of the water or going back down into the water. Have you looked into any of that?
Well, sorry, I got a little congestion going on here, but looked into. Yeah, I mean, I haven't consciously gone after it, but I have been directed in those directions. I'll tell you about a case where I was asked to remote view what would count as a USO. But let me tell you that story later. Recently, I had the opportunity to present and do a remote viewing workshop for an organization up in Park City, Utah, and of course, everybody knows that Utah is the home state for Skinwalker Ranch. And one of the folks on the program, besides myself, was Brandon Fugel, who owns Skinwalker Ranch. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, about the rest of what he said, but he did show a video, which was, he showed the raw footage off of the GoPro that was attached to his helicopter during one particular event that they filmed. And it's been aired on the program. We've seen it on the what's the name of the thing? Secret of Skinwalker Ranch
on the History Channel. Yeah,
on the History Channel. I keep forgetting because there's a bunch of different Skinwalker Ranch things. I keep forgetting which one that is, but I think it's a Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, right? So anyway, they've showed it, but in a pretty low resolution. He showed the original raw footage, and that was impressive, I have to tell you. It showed an object going from, and we'll call it UAP. It was a very bright point of light going from, I'd say roughly, I have to think about this, roughly about 2 o'clock, but at a high elevation from the perspective of the camera, and plunging earthward at a high rate of speed towards the top of the mesa. And I'd say, let's see now, this would be the east end of the mesa away from the ranch. And it's coming down at a high rate of speed. And as it approaches the top of the mesa itself, that at that point that was opposite of it, starts to glow. There's this answering glow that kind of moves up into the sky a little ways. And then this object merges with the glow, disappears into the mesa. At least that's what it looked like. And literally just a second or two later, that thing comes shooting out the base of the mesa. At this point, instead of vertically, it's coming horizontally across the ground, but up in the air. I don't know. My estimate would say 100 meters or so. It's coming out at the same rate of speed towards and passes under the helicopter. And it's just like it emerged from the solid sandstone that this thing's made out of, that the mesa is made out of. And I'll tell you, I was I was astonished. I really was. And at this video, now I've seen a lot of purported UFO videos. Some of them are fairly persuasive. A lot of them are very obviously faked. And probably the most of them, it's hard to tell if they're faked or not.
Because they're so freaking blurry, Paul. Like it's always astonishing, Paul, that a lot of the UFO footage looks like it's filmed on an early 2000s flip phone. Like, you're telling me that all this footage is super blurry, and the only reason that I can come to the reason that the footage is so blurry is because the footage is fake, and they're trying to hide something within the footage by making the footage very blurry.
Well, that's quite possible. Now, some of the stuff that I'm referring to isn't necessarily blurry. It's just not clearly real. It could be, but you could think of ways where it might not be. You know, it's not certifiably real footage. This that Brendan showed, I could not see any way you could fake that. This was something that, all other, possibilities excluded, this was as close to real as anything I've seen in terms of UFO footage. And I was very interesting. Now, he had a name for it, and your folks there probably heard the name. In fact, maybe you have too. He called it a transmaterial UAP. I have to say that was the first time I heard that term. I'd heard USO and UAP and UFO, but I'd not heard, let's see, that would be TMUFO. right? Transmaterial UAP. I had not heard that term before, but it's very an applicable term, and it works well with USOs as well, because technically a USO is also a transmaterial UAP. But if you think about it, any kind of UFO or UAP is transmaterial unless you're outside the atmosphere of the Earth when you're in deep space and there's no material for it to be going through. And of course, we don't have many or any real observational instances of something that's in deep space like that. There's been claims made, and who knows, but most of what we observe is either in the atmosphere itself, or it is coming into and going out of the atmosphere through the sea or other water, body of water, or in this case, this thing going through solid rock. At least the appearance was it was going through. Now, again, as with an unidentified aerial phenomenon, the acronym itself, it appeared to go through solid rock. Maybe it didn't, until we have some really solid analytical tools and there's sufficient data. It's hard for it to say whether it was really traveling through this material, this substance, or not. But it certainly, to all observational indications, it was going through the rock. It did go through the rock.
Did this look like a solid object, or did it look like a light, like a bright light? Because that's something that a lot of people claim about Mount Shasta as well.
Yeah.
Is that Mount Shasta is like a extraterrestrial portal, and the ancient civilization of Lemuria and Atlantis live inside of Mount Shasta, and there's
Yeah.
light orbs that go into the side of the mountain all the time, and it's like this extraterrestrial base.
So let's say it this way. Its appearance included a very bright light, okay, very bright and seemingly pretty clear, distinct light. Whether that was a light associated with an object, whether the object was itself radiating that light, I don't know, or maybe it was just singularly a light. And of course, there, from just looking at it, you can't tell. If a UAP is not lit up, it's very unusual that anyone could see it, right? I mean, it's just, we need to have the light to be able to recognize that there's something there, particularly the ones we see in the dark. Now, it's quite possible that we see UAPs all the time during the day, but they're so faint because it's light, bright, the sun is shining, and they aren't as easy to pick out during the daylight hours. But at night, when the contrast is very significant, then maybe we see the light better. Again, there are obviously instances of UAPs being spotted during the day, and sometimes they're spotted because they are very bright during the day, and oftentimes it's because they're opaque and there's enough ambient illumination that you can tell that there's something there. You can't say one size fits all for any of this stuff, right? There's so many different instances of it. But so that goes back to your question: was it just a light, or was it an object that was lit up? I don't know. I'm inclined to think it was an object just because of the way it behaved. I mean, at least the way we understand the physical universe, in order for a light to behave in the way this behaved, it has to be attached to something, which implies an object. So I guess that's where I'm going with this ultimately.
But then that brings into the question of, if this phenomenon is extraterrestrial, which I personally don't believe that it's extraterrestrial, but if it is, and we're under the assumption that it is extraterrestrial, why would these extraterrestrials be driving around with big bright lights on their craft if they don't want to be seen?
See, I take that. So you're posing that almost as a rhetorical question, which means the answer is implied in the question. So why would they doing that? That must mean X, Y, Z, whatever you want it to mean. But I take it as more of an empirical question. If these things are extraterrestrial, why would they be navigating? Let's use navigate to avoid the flying word, right? Why would they be navigating around with this bright line unless they wanted to advertise or something, right? Well, I mean, it's possible. Let's hypothesize, or let's speculate a couple of reasons. One might be that their means of locomotion, their means of moving around to use the best term we have, may require a lot of visible spectrum radiation, light radiation, right? And so they can't move without making a bright light just because of the physics of whatever that is they're using. Now, that's one speculative possibility. Another one is that in fact they do want themselves to their craft or whatever to be seen for whatever purposes they want us to recognize that they're there, and we don't know what those purposes are yet. So that's a second speculative possibility. Let's see if I can think of something else. And if you can think of something else, chime in.
I mean, those are two, I think, reasonable possibilities. It's just like if they don't want to, I mean, we're under the speculatory notion that if they are indeed extraterrestrials, they don't want to be known because they haven't landed, they haven't really shown themselves physically to the population. Then it's speculatory in that way. And then it's also, well, if they don't want to be known, then why would they drive around? I mean, in your answer to that is maybe that something with their craft creates the light itself, and they're not actually able to get rid of the light altogether. But then you talk about, people claim that they have like a cloaking ability of their craft as well. So
let me toss in, cloaking is also speculation.
Right.
We don't know if they do. People say, oh yeah, they do. Well, how do you know that? Have you actually captured one?
Right.
And there are people who say who we have, but that hasn't been publicized. So someone out there in the media world who says, yeah, they've got a cloaking device, we say, well, how do you know? Well, some aliens from Zeta Reticuli told me that. Well, okay. I mean, that's not impossible they did, but I'd have to see much better evidence than just your claim that some alien told you that, right? So.
Right. Oh, what are you saying, Paul, that you don't believe all these extraterrestrial channelers, Paul? Come on now. No, I'm just joking. Yeah, there's a lot of claim. I mean, really, almost all of this is speculatory and theory. I mean, we have really zero proof of extraterrestrial involvement. And,
at least publicly, we have zero proof. I have no idea what there is privately or secretly held. Maybe there is, but publicly, as far as we know, there's no proof.
Well, they've kind of been saying the same thing since the very beginning with Project Grudge and Project Sign and Project Blue Book and the most recent UAP historical record from Arrow. And now they've kind of changed it to where they publicly say that it's majority of it is military craft, military drones, or misidentified military craft. Mm-hmm. It's pretty much what they've been saying, which they've kind of been alluding to that all along. And but now they say, which I don't really know if there was ever a point that they actually denied the phenomenon existed. I think that what they were trying to do was deny that it was extraterrestrial, which makes more sense to me.
Yeah, and I think that it's legitimate to say that at least a large percentage of what people are saying are, military test aircraft phenomena, misidentified phenomena, meteorological phenomena, stuff like that. I think there are a lot of reports of UAPs, UFOs that really are explainable that way. I don't think there's any question about that. But even the government investigators have been releasing these reports, acknowledge that there is at least a small subset that they have not been able to explain that way. And I appreciate that amount of honesty that they express, that they're willing at least to go that far. Now, of course, then you get the skeptical scientists and government officials who say, well, because you can explain all of them as that, then that must mean, all right, because you can explain most of them that way, that must mean then they all are that way, that they all are explainable in those terms. We just haven't found that solution, that explanation yet. And see, that's actually not a scientific attitude. That's
right.
essentially a non-falsifiable premise. And if you can't falsify a claim, then you can't assume that your interpretation is going to be correct. You have to allow the possibility that there might really be something to it. So, yeah, I probably chewed that one to death here. So,
Well, I mean, that's what J. Allen Hynek's problem was with Project Grudge and Project Sign. And I had Paul Hynek on last week, which is his son, and that was his issue with it, was that Project Grudge and Project Sign, he claimed, was an unscientific endeavor into the phenomenon itself.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I mean,
Paul's a nice guy. I got to meet him at Starworks. She's 2 or 3 years ago, I guess. I'm glad you were able to have him on your show.
Yeah, he's very, very intelligent man, and he had really good things to say. So, not to really get too much off topic here, but kind of in another direction and more with remote viewing and UFOs. And I kind of want to confirm or deny a speculatory thing that's been running around since the early 2000s that involved the DIA and Army Intelligence Remote Viewing Program, which was that Jim Mars, at a lecture he was giving in the early 2000s, he said that apparently Skip Atwater got some coordinates of some alien bases that supposedly Pat Price and Ingo Swann had remote viewed, and gave those coordinates to some of the remote viewers at Fort Meade to also remote view. Is this true or false?
No, it's true. Yeah. So a couple of things happened back then. Now, I want to first reassure you, there was some loose gun remote viewing of UFOs that happened at Fort Meade. And then there were some carefully done, relatively legitimate remote viewing of UFOs and UAPs and such done there. And Skip was very careful to do this in a legitimate way. And in fact, my talk at Contact is going to show examples of some of the less credible ones and the more credible ones. And Skip did get, so Put Off was the one that was Keeper of the Keys with the Pat Price UFO work. In fact, I'll tell you briefly. I'll also actually give show a clip during my talk where I interview Hal, where he explains how this all came to be with Pat Price. So one day, Pat Price walks into the office at SRI and says, well, I got a little bored last night. And I'm paraphrasing here, obviously. He said, I got a little bored last night. I decided to kind of scout around the planet to see if I could find any UFO bases. And I found 4. And he throws his papers on the desk and talks to Hal, explains to Hal what he found. And he was never tasked to do that by the SRI researchers or CIA or anybody else. It's something he just did on his own for a lark, as Hal calls it. And there were 4 of them. Mount Pinatubo in the Pyrenees. There's a Mount Zeal in Australia, Mount Hayes in Alaska. And then there's a mountain in, I want to say Zimbabwe, but I can't remember the name of it. And Skip actually had a number of us, gave us the lat longs and had us remote view these locations without us having any idea what was there or what was allegedly there. And some of us provided some really provocative kind of information. I and Mel Riley are the ones I found the best material from. That's probably not good English. I and Mel Riley, but whatever. So both of us reported a cavern-like passageway into the mountain. This was the Mount Hayes site. And both of us discovered people. We called them people. And I said people. I said, I'm not exactly sure they're people in the normal sense, but they're people, right? So anyway, and we talked about them and apparatus technology and stuff, and yeah, that's again some of the things I'll talk about when I get to contact. Anyway, and then there were some other things he had us remote view as well that didn't involve Pat Price. But so that's the very basic confirmation. Yes, in fact, that did happen. And I think the data produced was at least, I'm not going to say it was 100% accurate because no remote viewing ever is 100% accurate. Or let's just say very rarely is ever a remote viewing 100% accurate. There are probably a few exceptions. But the data was actually collected in an appropriate way. And I think that at least some of it was trustworthy. So, interesting stuff.
Did you view all 4 of these UFO bases on Earth? You mentioned one in Australia, Antarctica, Africa. And
well, none in Antarctica. Nothing in Antarctica.
But was that not a part of his original?
No,
it wasn't. Okay.
They all were temperate zone. There was Europe, Africa, Alaska, and Australia. Those were the 4.
It was Alaska and Antarctica. My fault. Yeah, I'm going off of memory here, and it's difficult to remember.
Well, that rumor could have got an Antarctica location attached to it. Rumors tend to do that. Let me say this: I'm having a bit of a medical issue. I have to have a hip replacement replaced. But I've heard that rumor coming in from all kinds of directions where I fell down and broke my hip, or I had an accident, my hip was broken, or whatever, it's not quite as extreme as that, although it might have been easier if that had happened. They'd be starting from scratch that way. But rumors tend to grow with the telling, and
right, and snowball into something that it was never meant to be. But that's why we got you on, Paul, because you were officially there. You were officially a part of this DIA Army Intelligence Stargate Project, even though Stargate Project, it wasn't always called that. We're just using that as reference, of course, here. So there were 4 bases that Pat Price originally viewed.
So let's say it this way. Pat Price reported on there being 4 bases.
Okay.
Were there? Well, we haven't confirmed that, although there is some interesting corroborating information. Of course, there's the work that Mel and I did on Mount Hayes. And when Pat gave this info to Hal happened to know, was it Hal? I think the CIA guy they were interacting with, who may have been Kit Green at the time, knew the CIA station chief out in Central Australia. And so he called him up and said, "Hey, George," or whatever his name was, says, "Hey, George, I'm interested in that in that area up around Mount Zeal." And the station chief allegedly responded, "Oh, you mean that place where the UFOs are always flying around up there?" And so Hal took that as not confirmation, but very interesting circumstantial evidence that maybe there was something to what Pat had reported.
Now, when you viewed one of these facilities, was this a underground facility?
So it was, first of all, both Mel and I identified that it was a mountain. It was very tall, and what we were accessing was partway up the mountain. And so what we're talking about is, let me say, like a tunnel. That's probably about the best way to describe it. A tunnel that went back into the mountain, and that much we agreed on. Mel got a little more detail than I did. Sorry, I'm going to move around here a little bit. Mel got a little more detail than I did. Well, it depends. He got more detail on some things. I got more detail on other things. But I determined that back in this, of course, this tunnel widens up into a big space, a chamber or a cavern, if you will, whatever. And there were people in here, and they were dealing with stuff. And I had the impression that what their main focus was maintenance and repair. And in fact, it was interesting because, of course, I'd been in the Army for a while by then, and I knew that military personnel very often are never happy with where they're stationed, no matter how nice it is. I've had folks who get sent to Hawaii and stationed in Hawaii, and I've heard them say, "Oh, I hate this place. I don't want to be here. It's just so boring," and blah blah blah. Right? And then they'll say, "I really want to be up in at Fort Lewis, up in Washington State." And then they get to Washington State and they say, "Oh, I really hate it here. I don't like this place. It's so boring." Obviously it's not the place that's the problem. It's the person. But I got kind of a bit of a feeling from these people. It's like they were deployed, is what we would say deployed in the military. They were deployed away from home, presumably a long way away from home. And they were here and they didn't really want to be here. They had this tedious job to do. They had to do, I don't know, change the oil in a flying saucer. I don't know. And they're here and they're feeling just kind of, I don't know, I can hardly wait till I can get out of here and go home again or whatever. And I'm getting that feeling. And what they're working on were these objects. And I would, frankly, this was, of course, done in it was probably no later than 1984. In fact, I'm sure it was 1984 or maybe 1985 when I'm doing this. And I'm sketching this thing that if you look at the sketches that people are making of the UAPs, that sketch matched their description. It was like two kind of a clamshell with a center line around it. The interesting thing is I had not seen Pat Price's work at that point. I never did see his stuff until about 2010, roughly, and which I got to see it. Hal showed it to me. And his sketch of one of these objects really matched my sketch of one of these objects. And of course, he had never met me and I'd never met him. I'd never seen his work. He clearly had never seen my work because he was dead before I ever got into this stuff. And so that was kind of a confirmation to me. Whether it counts as scientific confirmation, probably not, but it is evidence. It's pretty solid evidence of a sort. And they had these things in there, and these things were not sitting on the ground. It's like they were hovering. If I'm remembering this session right, I haven't looked at it in a long time, but I'm pretty sure it was this session I'm telling you about, that they were just kind of like, when they weren't being used, they were just sitting there hovering a foot or two off the ground. They're sitting there, right? And when they needed to do something with them or whatever, then they would go out and just kind of push them around. They move them by pushing one over here and then another one over here, and I guess that was like when they were updating the avionics on them or whatever the presumably alien equivalent of our maintenance procedures on aircraft and stuff are. It was really quite a fascinating thing. Of course, then afterwards, when did he tell me what the target was? I don't even remember when Skip gave me feedback on it. It was a while before he told me, and that was a surprise. It was quite a surprise. And kind of a vindication, because I felt like I was getting stuff that was correct, but I didn't have any evidence. And I was coming to feel like this was not something, well, I fairly quickly came to feel this was not something normal. This is not something one would normally expect to find on an everyday target. So anyway.
Did you get the impression that this was military or something else?
Well, and now I'm talking from 40 years ago, right? I'd have to go back to the session to tell you, but I feel fairly confident in saying this. I got the impression that it was at the very least organized, that it was not just, like a lot of civilian things are, they're sort of ad hoc, fly by night kind of a deal. This was certainly structured, organized, in a way kind of regimented. And it certainly could be military. Military, and that's one of our terms, right? You say it's military, it's one of our terms. And if you think about military, even in our terms, can mean a lot of things. We think of, for example, Star Trek. I think Star Trek is the military organization, and of course they get out and they shoot at things and get shot at and whatever. But their main mission allegedly is not to do the shooting; it's to avoid shooting and to to do research and rescue people and that kind of thing. And I guess that's military function. It's just, and this could have been that kind of thing, kind of like a organized, regimented kind of a exploration and let's see, what are the word we use? And at least, having a presence in a certain location without necessarily worrying about being any kind of fight or conflict or whatever. I guess that's a long answer to your question. Sort of military, I guess, is how I'd shortly answer it.
Could possibly be military. Do you remember what Pat Price had said in his notes on? Did he describe what he felt like that it was?
Well, here's the interesting thing, and I don't recall in detail right now, but I do know that he sort of identified purposes or functions for each of the sites, and one of them was repair and maintenance. And so I'm getting this impression, of course, 10 years after Pat Price had died, and 15 years or 25 years before I even got any feedback on this. And yet I'm calling it, a maintenance repair facility. So I really should go back and see if I can verify which one of these places Pat thought was a repair and maintenance facility, because it certainly matched what I was getting on Mount Hayes.
Well, then you have, maintenance repair facility is kind of ambiguous. It could be a maintenance repair facility for the military or for military aircraft. I guess the question would be is how do you relate a maintenance repair facility to some sort of UFO or UAP?
Sure. So now I may push back a bit on saying it's ambiguous. Maintenance and repair in almost any activity pretty much is the same thing. Now, the activities may be different. The spare parts might be different. What needs to be repaired, maintained could be different. But the concept of maintenance and repair is pretty much always the same. A over-the-road trucking company a civilian trucking company really has pretty much the same kind of, conceptually the same kind of maintenance repair tasks as does an armored battalion, an Army tank battalion. It's just that what you do that maintenance repair on may be different and its purpose may be different. And I don't know if I can go into detail, and in fact, I know I can't go into detail as what kinds of aspects of maintenance repair are involved here, other than, and of course I'm kind of off the top of my head here, other than thinking in terms of just making sure these things can fulfill their mission, whatever that is. And I couldn't tell you what their mission was. Make sure they were mission ready. And you could say that was true about a tank as much as you can say it's true about a Peterbilt semi, right? And so, that's probably the best I can do with that. But I didn't feel like maintenance repair was a particularly ambiguous concept here. What it was they were maintaining and repairing, okay, well, I did a sketch of it. They seem to be hovering over the floor. I don't know what else to tell you, right?
Right. All right, that makes sense, absolutely. And from my understanding, also along with the coordinates that supposedly Skip Atwater brought in to give some of the remote viewers at the DIA and Army Intelligence at Fort Meade, apparently, now again, this is speculation and I want you to confirm or deny, apparently someone was also having some of the remote viewers view targets off world, like Mars and the moon. Right. Is that true or false?
That's also true. Now, I don't remember Skip doing that all that much with us. So there's another part to the saga. I told you about the Pat Price stuff. Another thing that we got relatively early on. So, the JPL photographs, the face on the moon and the pyramids and all that stuff that Richard Hoagland got a lot of traction out of, and other people as well. Put off was given was given early access to those photos, and he had pretty much all of them. And he passed them along, or maybe got copies sent to Skip Atwater. And Skip did run folks on the unique features that were depicted in these photographs. There's this, it keeps popping up all the time, and people act like it's the first time they ever saw it, and they get all excited, like, oh, do you know the CIA was remote viewing Mars 1 million years ago, right? And okay, yeah, we heard that story last week, and we heard it a month ago, and we heard it the year before last, and we heard it back in 1996 when it was first released. And yeah, just because you've not heard it before doesn't mean that everybody else hasn't heard it before, right?
Classic regurgitation.
Yes.
Like everything within the community. It all goes in circles.
Yes, and the recent one example of that is, of course, the Gateway Project. People are all excited about that paper. We won't go into that today, so that's off topic. But
right, a lot of confusion there. Yeah,
there's a huge amount of confusion. So anyway, the session they're talking about is a session Skip Atwater did with Joe McMoneagle at the Monroe Institute. So towards the end of Joe's career, the last, I want to say 6 months, at least 4 months, maybe 6 months, they got a contract with the Monroe Institute for Joe to go down there regularly, and they would explore the possibilities of using hemisync and remote viewing in the way Joe did remote viewing back then, with Skip monitoring. Sometimes Bob Monroe was monitoring and such. And Skip used that opportunity to test this out. And one of the targets was, well, Skip could tell you better than I could, but I want to say it was the pyramids, the photo with the pyramids on it. And so I'm starting to really get kind of uncomfortable here. We'll see how much longer this is going to last. So he runs Joe on it. Of course, Joe famously described these aliens underground who were actually dead, but they were still perceivable. And it was like Skip had him keep regressing back, a long ways into the past. And anyway,
was this on the moon or
Mars?
Mars.
Yeah.
Okay.
These are the JPL photos. These are all Martian photos of the Martian surface. JPL, for maybe people listening, and I should explain, JPL stands for Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and they were, and maybe still are, the ones behind a lot of our space probes. Their mission was to get these projects together and get them launched out there, and then analyze the data that we got from them. And one of these was, so my memory is really hosed on this, but I think that the project actually was in the early 80s. And so the fact that we got these photos in 84, they were pretty fresh at the time. Anyway, the JPL photos, and Skip targeted Joe on the pyramids, and they went back in time, and they had Joe got these impressions of aliens underground, and that who were at the time a dying race. And so the assumption was they were dead by the time, we got the JPL photographs and so on. And that's one certifiable instance where Skip did have somebody remote viewing off planet. And I think there are more. I'm not sure which ones they are. He's working on a book with one of my associates, Jana Roca, a German student of mine and assistant, called Project 8100. That's Skip had accumulated all of his UFO related and remote viewing related material where it came together, right? And I hope I'm okay saying this. It's not ready for prime time yet, but that's they're working on it. So that'll be interesting. And all that material will be in there. And it's so let me I've been taking a long time talking about this. Let me skip over to other people, mainly Ed Dames. So Ed Dames came on board 3 years after I did. He joined the program 3 years after I did. And he was there for 3 years, left in, I've got in my book, Reading the Enemy's Mind. Actually, I think it's even in my other book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. One or the other, or both, will give you the details on this. But he joined the program at the end of January in 1986, and he left again, I think, at the end of 1988. He was transferred out. But during that time, he got all excited about UFOs and remote viewing. The idea, of course, and you'll hear me mention this, the contact, assuming I'm not in the middle of having surgery at the time, in the middle of contact, I'm going to talk about this, but anytime you have a mystery like UFOs, it's always tempting to use an enigma like remote viewing to try and solve it, right? And so that's what people often did. Is it started with Dames primarily, but it was a little bit with Pat Price and Ingo Swann as well. Here we have this UFO problem, and it seems intractable using our conventional means of collecting information. So what can we do? Well, let's try remote viewing. And so I tried remote viewing, but Ed was way ahead of the game with that. He had us remote viewing stuff that's questionable if it even existed, but he was persuaded it did. and one of those things was all this stuff off planet. I mean, he had us remote viewing things on Mars, and I don't think he had access to the JPL photos. I think this is stuff that he thought was there. I know one he had targeted me on was Titan, the moon of, I want to say Saturn, is it? I forget which one it is. He had me. I don't think he ever had me remote view the moon. Although Ingo actually asked me to help him with a couple of lunar projects, so he remote view the moon. A bunch of stuff. One of his famous amongst us, and it has actually become famous out there in the remote viewing world, is where he has remote viewing the Supreme Galactic Council. Now,
What?
as far as I can tell, he had really no reason at all to think that there was such a thing as a Supreme
Right.
Galactic Council, but he'd come to believe that there was, and so he had us remote viewing the Supreme Galactic Council. Now, for a remote viewer, that's really highly annoying. We don't want to be doing targets that you don't even know for sure exist, because it could be a total waste of time. And remote viewing, I don't know, an incident that happened just on the Earth that never really happened, and they task you on that, and then you find out afterwards there was no such event at all. You want to kill the guy who told you to do it, at least figuratively kill, right? And so I have no idea why he thought there was a Supreme Galactic Council. He'd been reading the Urantia book at the time, and I don't know. I've not read the book. I mean, it's like 2,500 pages long.
Big book.
Is it? Have you read the whole thing?
I haven't read the whole thing. I haven't even read the first pages, but I know pretty much the concept of it, and a lot of people rip it off. A lot of people rip off the Rancher book and try and take its ideas for their own.
Well, it's possible that something like a Supreme Galactic Council is mentioned in there. I don't know. Maybe because he was a real, almost say fanatic, but that's probably not the right word. He was very devoted to reading that book. I'm pretty sure he digested the whole thing, the entire Rancher book. But if that's the only place I can think of where he would come up with the idea that there might be a Supreme Galactic. But anyway, he had us remote view the Supreme Galactic Council, and of course, anytime you divide by zero, you can end up with anything. And I think that's kind of what happened with this, is that every viewer had a whole different, response to that tasking. Now, of course, we didn't know it was a Supreme Galactic Council is what we're supposed to be remote viewing. We were just given a set of numbers and said, have at it. And I've, before, probably on the last interview, in fact, I might have explained how that works. But anyway, yeah.
Wow, you had everyone remote viewing the Supreme Galactic Council that doesn't
At least some
exist.
At least
wild. That's so wild. But then what happens if you get something on that and it's a figment of someone's imagination? Does that diminish the science of remote viewing at all whenever you're seeing something that's not even factually there?
It does in the eyes of people who are already skeptical. But if you understand what can happen in a situation like this, the thing I call telepathic overlay, actually Ingo Swann, the guy who created remote viewing in the first place, coined that term. Telepathic overlay happens when there's a number of ways it can happen, but in this particular case, when a viewer is tasked on a target that actually is non-existent, that doesn't exist, then their subconscious gets out there and says, oh, there's nothing here. Well, they wouldn't have sent me out here if they hadn't expected me to find something. Well, where is it? And starts looking around. And so what happens is the next most powerful psychic signal attracts the subconscious, the viewer's subconscious. And if it's the case of Ed Dames believing that there is a Supreme Galactic Council, then the viewer's subconscious latches onto that belief and says, oh, this must be it. There's this very strong signal about this thing. And they wouldn't say, the subconscious wouldn't identify as a Supreme Galactic Council, but as a group of these entities who are working, whatever, blah, 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 right? And so then the viewer starts reporting back this perception that they're getting out of Ed Dames's own mind and reporting that back. And of course, then that confirms I'm using Ed Dames collectively here now, and then he reports back on what is in the tasker's mind. And then the tasker takes that as confirmation that what he or she believed about this thing is true. And yet all that's being fed back is that person's beliefs that they already had in the first place. So,
wow, that's really interesting. Telepathic overlay is what that's called?
Yeah.
Telepathic overlay. So that means that someone's belief in something can create something out of nothing.
Well, nothing is being created just other than a perception of some kind, right? And it's not even a concrete perception. It's a intentional perception, I guess you could say. And so, it's a sort of it's information of a sort, I guess you could say. It's just not concrete information, not solid, real, verifiable, objective information, as we hopefully will usually get in a remote viewing session. So.
But how many, this is just hypothetical and theory, but how many people would it take believing in a fake event in order for someone to, or in like anything fake, like, that there's a giant spaghetti monster that crashed in Washington in 1952. How many people would it take to actually believe in that event in order for someone to see that event?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is your question almost sounds like a light bulb joke. How many people would it take to screw in a light bulb, a spaghetti monster light bulb, right?
Right. But if you're taking into consideration that one person can create something that, but you would think by the more people that believe in something, the easier would it be to see that event.
Well,
we could take Roswell, for example. A lot of people believe that Roswell happened.
Yeah, that's a possibility. In fact, I am reluctant ever to remote view some recent sensational, widely publicized event, because there can be a kind of a cultural overlay developed by that, which a lot of people, what more happens is it generates a whole lot of, if you will, psychic noise, right? There's all kinds of beliefs flying around, intentions flying around and stuff that pollute or contaminate the actual data that's also out there trying to compete. And so generally speaking, people say, well, if you're remote viewed, whatever happened to what was it, 370, what was the one that went down in the Indian Ocean, and they haven't been able to find it ever since.
Flight 237 or something like that.
Whatever it is, 370, I think, but I can't remember what airlines anymore. I say no. No, and I don't plan on it. Oh, why not? If you can find it, look at it. Well, I say, well, because there is so much noise associated with it now that knowing whether or not, or even being able to evaluate whether you got legitimate data or not, is very difficult, right? So I caution anybody against going for these really high profile kind of targets like Jean-Benet Ramsey, the little girl that went missing, I mean, they've been subject to so many psychics and so much speculation, so many news stories and stuff. It's just go for the stuff that nobody's ever heard of before, and you might have a higher chance of having success. So yeah,
It was Malaysian. It was Malaysian Airlines
Malaysia,
flight
yes.
370. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah. So the question, how many people? Who knows? One is enough if there's no target at all in a close-knit remote viewing project. But this can go to Rupert Sheldrake and his formative causation theories about what people sometimes call 100th monkey. How many people does it take to create a cultural meme? How many people does it take to make an idea active in a formative causation scenario like Rupert Sheldrake might propose? I don't think you can even have a certain number. There's probably a lot of variables associated if this phenomenon even exists. Now, I have a suspicion it's something, if it doesn't, then something very much like it does. But we don't have the ultimate scientific there, to assume that it is absolutely correct. But I don't know. Certainly, it would take at least one person. Let's put it that way. At least one person has to have a belief about something in order for it to develop some kind of, I'll say, faux reality or fake reality of its own.
Yeah, it's just a really interesting concept because you have like this thought and this idea of like egregores, which is an occult concept that whatever you believe in, whatever you take your energy into, whatever you focus your thoughts and ideas towards, it then creates it, regardless if it's real or not. So I would...
that concept postmodernists really love. That means everybody's truth is true, right?
Right, and that becomes a really big problem. But I'm meaning it in like a collective sense. Like something can happen, and if enough people believe in that thing, it's regardless if it's real or not, it's still in people's consciousness as it being real.
Sure.
But go ahead.
I have to tell you, I'm going to have to pull a plug. I'm really getting uncomfortable here.
Well, Paul Smith, I think you really appreciate your time this evening, and through your health problems, I really appreciate your time, and you were able to make it through. And can you let people know one more time about your lecture at Contact in the Desert?
Contact in the Desert, the end of May and the beginning of June, out in Palm Desert. Indian Springs, I guess it is. And I'm going to be talking about remote viewing UFOs or UAPs for the more progressively minded. I'm looking forward to it, and hopefully my medical issues won't get in the way. I'm counting on still being able to do it. We'll see. Anything can change, right? Anyway, I appreciate the time to be on. If folks want to check out my website, that's rviewer.com, the letter R and the word viewer, .com. And we'll do this again, I'm hoping.
Yes, thanks so much, Paul. Really appreciate you. The links to Paul's information and the links to the tickets at Contact in the Desert is in the description of this video. And if you use promo code Earth10, you'll get 10% off that ticket price. And thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate your time.
Betcha.
And come and see us at Contact in the Desert. Please be sure to hit the thumbs up button, help the channel and the algorithm, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well for notifications. And we'll see you guys next time.